We're thrilled to be here today for this wonderful occasion. Jesse, we love you. We're so proud of you. And I'm aware that you're named for my late brother. I'm always surprised at how we feel a deceased person still lives among the living, if that person bears the name. And today, especially, we're proud of you. You have a genius for becoming bar mitzvah at this wonderful time in the life of this great congregation. While its cantor, Benny Meisner, is still active in this final year, Benny and I were ordained in the same service at Hebrew Union College in 1968. And also the fact that the rabbi of this congregation is so multi-talented. And also that we have the Schwartz-Reisman atrium completed in time for your bar mitzvah. And you have displayed such terrific skills in readings of prayer book and Torah and Haftarah. As the poet Emerson said, "So nigh is grandeur to our dust, so near is God to man. When duty whispers low, you must. The youth replies, I can." And you have replied, I can, and you did. Shabbat Shalom to the whole congregation. I begin with a different poem, also by a New England poet, Robert Frost. His well-known poem, Fire and Ice, suggested itself to me as a contrast to the Noah story. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. While this grim poem may seem casual in tone, it is alarmingly serious in speculation that the world will come to an end in one of two ways, with fire or ice, through desire or hate. Either way, the end of the world will happen due to human beings. Our story of Noah, on the other hand, is the classic tale of worldwide destruction except for Noah, his family, and the animals. God destroys all other life due to the sin of Hamas, which is variously translated as lawlessness or violence. The story need not and should not be taken too literally. After all, there are currently some 3 million species of animal life on Earth. But it works as a metaphor for the survival of life. At the end of the story, which we heard today, God promises never again to destroy life by a flood. And of course, the pessimists always say, yeah, but what about other kinds of destruction? Jews, however, have remained more optimistic, despite our experience of persistent anti-Semitism in Jewish history that might have turned us into pessimists. We take our cue from the first covenant that appears in the Bible, the covenant between God and Noah, that is, between God and all of humankind. God says in his perdurable will that God will not destroy the earth again. In Genesis 9, we heard today, God says, "When I bring clouds over the earth and my bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature among all flesh, so that the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." Now, over the course of some 5 decades in the rabbinate, I have asked various people of all ages, so why is the rainbow such a good symbol for a covenant of peace? I ask you now. I've heard various answers ranging from because the rainbow is so pretty, and perhaps closer to home because the rainbow is connected with rain, water, and if you get it in great abundance, you have a flood. I prefer the answer that was given by two 13th century commentators, Bachya ibn Pakuda of Spain and Chizkuni of France. Their answer was reaffirmed by two 20th century biblical scholars, Gerhard von Rad of Heidelberg, Germany, and Ephraim Speiser of the University of Pennsylvania. And all of them note that the Hebrew word for rainbow, keshet, is also the word for bow, as in bow and arrow. And if you point your bow with an arrow away from the earth, it is a sign of peace for the earth. And the rainbow is like that bow. So whenever we see a rainbow, we can be reminded that human beings and life on earth will continue to go on. And we're always grateful for that. Remember that the next time you see a rainbow. Despite serious threats today to the continued existence of humankind, we will survive. So I want to discuss with you what are but three of the major threats to continued human life. And they are three among others: global warming, atomic warfare, and overpopulation. And I have just a while to do that. Each one a dreadful threat to us and our offspring, but each one is surmountable. Don't ask me how exactly. They are surmountable. First, global warming, which is receiving great attention in recent years. You can hardly pick up a newspaper without something about global warming. Anyone who cares to point to massive evidence of extreme weather events, glacier retreat, changes in seasonal events, and agricultural productivity, the rise of sea levels, the decline of Arctic sea ice, some part of this global warming must be attributed to human beings. The burning of fossil fuels has led to greater atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitric oxide. Some say greater than have existed for at least the last 800,000 years. One study made by James Hansen of Columbia University and 16 other scientists in 2015 suggests that a 3-meter rise in sea level could well become a reality by the end of this century. The magnitude of global warming came home to me when my wife Greta Lee and I visited your Canadian Rockies and saw in your Jasper National Park the Athabasca Glacier. Perhaps some of you have been there and seen that. It is the most visited glacier in North America. It is receding at the rate of more than 5 meters or 16 feet every single year. And in the last 25 years, it has lost half of its volume. A month and a half ago, a UN panel of over 100 scientists, based on more than 7,000 studies, issued an alarming report on how climate change has affected the oceans. It said that if fossil fuel emissions continue to rise at the current rate, the maximum amount of fish in the ocean that can be sustainably caught could well decrease by a quarter by the end of the century. And we have all seen projections of maps showing new coastlines along the ocean shores how much the coastal land will be underwater even by the end of the century, if the encroachment of water continues unchecked. The UN report suggests that the loss of biodiversity is as severe a threat to humanity as climate change. 1 million species of plants and animals are now threatened with extinction, many within decades. We have already lost several million species over the last 200 or 300 years. We are on course to reduce the Earth's total biodiversity by 75% or more. Have a look at the October issue of National Geographic magazine for pictures of several dozen species of animals that are on the verge of extinction. And I'm not claiming that the problem of global warming and biodiversity loss are absolutely going to mean the end of life on Earth, but unless humans address the problem soon, it will be a very different kind of planet and a much poorer one. Last week we read from the Torah that God put the first human being into the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. The Ovda Uleshomra. We have done a much better job at working the earth than we have at keeping the earth. A second major threat to human life, and even greater, is atomic warfare. Atomic warfare has taken a fairly long break since the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, almost 75 years ago. Next August will mark that 75th anniversary. Since then, several nations have developed their own atomic and hydrogen bombs, and not only the so-called superpowers. The grim truth remains that the mushroom cloud hangs over all of us, adults, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Can it be that all men are cremated equal? At the risk of waxing morbid at this very festive occasion on this Shabbat, let me remind you of just one of the movies that has speculated about how atomic warfare will cause a mass extinction event. The movie On the Beach of 1959 starred Gregory Peck and Ava Gardner, was directed by Stanley Kramer. It was based on a 1957 best-selling novel by Neville Shute. The story of On the Beach takes place in Australia after everyone in the Northern Hemisphere has perished because of atomic bombs and radiation. That fictional war began between smaller countries and then spread due to treaty obligations to the superpowers as well, until over 140 atomic, hydrogen, and cobalt bombs wiped out all life in the Northern Hemisphere, and the massive radiation clouds were moving slowly toward the Southern Hemisphere, including Australia. The Gregory Peck character is a commander of a United States submarine docked in Melbourne. The opening and closing scenes of the movie show an empty downtown Melbourne with the ominous music in the background of Waltzing Matilda. The Peck character cannot bring himself to believe that his wife and children back in Mystic, Connecticut are no longer alive, even though everyone knows that no one is alive anymore in the Northern Hemisphere. His friend, an Australian Navy lieutenant commander, introduces him to the Ava Gardner character, a young party girl who drinks too much because she can't handle the prospect of her certain death in a few months, along with everyone else in Australia. This movie was not a comedy. If you want to see a comedy about atomic warfare ending all life, you have to see Dr. Strangelove. with Peter Sellers in 3 different characters, a movie directed by Stanley Kubrick. The relationship between the Peck character and the Gardner character develops, and she becomes much more mature, surprisingly, more sober, more stable. In the movie, they become involved romantically, whereas in the book, they have only a platonic relationship. Fewer and fewer people come to the beach to look out for those approaching clouds of radiation. More and more people are taking their suicide pills to avoid more painful deaths. The world ends first with a bang and then with a whimper. On the Beach, of course, is only a scary work of fiction. The promise of the rainbow, however, suggests a very different plan at work for our planet. As Isaiah said, God did not create it a waste, but formed it for habitation. Lo tohu v'ra'ah, lashevet yitzara. The third and final threat to continued human life is one on the far horizon: overpopulation. In 1970, there were some 3.5 billion people on Earth. I remember preaching a sermon then, including our prayers for the 3 astronauts of the damaged Apollo 13. I referred to them in that sermon as 3 out of 3.5 billion. Today, planet Earth contains, you know how many people? Close to 8 billion inhabitants on this good planet Earth. Equally alarming is that in 1970, there were 25 people for every square kilometer. Today, there are 52 people for every square kilometer on Earth. I remember also talking in the 1970s about the coming crisis of overpopulation. In a sermon at my congregation, which was then in Cincinnati, Ohio. We have many family here from Cincinnati. And I said at that time that, yes, there should be some limitation of the numbers of children, but not Jewish people. We need every Jew we can get. And I always was telling people to have another child, if possible. So there was one congregant who came up to me after the service and said, Rabbi, how do you square what you just said about overpopulation as a threat together with what you once said that we should have another child if possible? Have 3, a third child for the Jewish people. I said, you're right. I'm inconsistent. But we need every single Jew. And I went on to tell him that we shouldn't voluntarily limit our numbers. After the Holocaust and the loss of 6 million Jews, we still have not equaled the total number of Jews in the world as existed on Earth in the 1930s. We were 18 million Jews then. Maybe we are 14.8 million now. Nevertheless, advocates of zero population growth have a good point. Originally made by Thomas Malthus, an Anglican priest who lived at the end of the 18th century. He wrote that the power of population is infinitely greater than the power of the earth to produce subsistence. Population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence only increases in an arithmetical ratio. And I'm not telling you anything you don't already know or you can't intuit. The bounty of nature has its limits. Even with modern technology and new farm machinery and chemicals and vast virgin lands and sea depths ripe for agriculture and dredging. We know well the problem, and we still hope for some solution, at least a solution that would also pass an ethics test. We hope vaguely, but dread precisely. On the international level, no solution will seem feasible until it is necessary. Meanwhile, the problem of overpopulation remains a ticking global time bomb. Planet Earth is our contemporary Noah's Ark. Planet Earth sails through space, blue and green and white, against the black background. And its human inhabitants have the same predisposition to sin that God condemned as Hamas. The three threats to our fragile planet of global warming, nuclear war, and overpopulation are challenging, like fire and ice, but not insurmountable. Sane minds will prevail if moral hearts are willing. Or as Thomas Edison said, what human minds can create, human character can control. Whenever I see a rainbow in the sky, I find it strangely comforting to think of God's promise that the human race will endure, however transient each individual person. About this, the Talmud says, La have yeush, let there be no despair. It's a wonderful bit of advice, not only on the global level, but the individual level. Those here today who are facing challenges in your personal world, challenges of family problems or physical problems, mental problems, emotional problems, problems at the workplace, problems anywhere, remember what the Talmud says, La have yeush, let there be no despair. And that message we read as well in today's Haftarah, where the prophet we call second Isaiah, who was our greatest Hebrew poet, proclaimed that God has promised us all. For this to me is like the waters of Noah. As I swore that the waters of Noah nevermore will flood the earth, so I swear that I will not be angry with you, nor rebuke you. For the mountains may move and the hills be shaken, but my loyalty shall never move from you, nor my covenant of peace be shaken, said the Eternal One, who takes you back in love. Amen.